The night was cold, crisp, and clear, a winter stillness that felt sacred until the screaming began. It was New Year's Eve, 1944, deep within the low Vosges mountains. A foot of snow lay across the frozen ravines, reflecting the harsh moonlight back into the faces of the American defenders. For weeks, the men of the US 7th Army had been fighting a slow, brutal grind against the Siegfried Line, battling for every frozen village, now stretched dangerously thin. Their lines were about to be tested by a desperate, massive German counterstroke, Operation Nordwind. Along the front, the silence shattered just hours before midnight. Waves of German infantry, many clad in hastily issued white camouflage snowsuits, surged out of the thickly wooded, snowy ravines. They were silhouettes against the illuminated landscape, running in groups not with precision, but with a horrifying, primitive fury. The sound was not the disciplined advance of the early war Wehrmacht, but a cacophony of fear and desperation. Men were yelling curses in broken English and German, howling and screaming as they stumbled directly into pre-sighted American minefields and barbed wire. This immediate, chaotic violence was meant to compensate for their lack of training. Many of these Volksgrenadiers were former naval ratings and Luftwaffe ground crews, cobbled together and sent forward after only 4 weeks of preparation. But they came on, driven by the Führer's last inflexible order, throwing themselves against the defensive positions near Reyesvilla and the College de Biche. Bullets tore through the snow-covered trees, sounding like ripping canvas in the frigid air. The air smelled of burnt powder and pine. A single machine gunner, Private Leon Outlaw, hunkered down, his weapon spitting fire across the snowfields. Tracer rounds painted streaks of death onto the white canvas as the German tide crashed against his solitary position. This was not the war of overwhelming American air and armor superiority. This was a brutal, up-close infantry fight for survival in the most unforgiving landscape Europe offered. But how had the American advance, the swift pursuit across France, devolved so quickly into this brutal, attritional struggle against an enemy that should have been broken? The answer lay entirely in the geography. 3 months earlier, the US 7th Army, linking up with Patton's 3rd Army, found itself tasked with advancing through the Vosges Mountains. This was a formidable natural barrier that had historically thwarted armies. The Vosges was not merely high ground, it was a complex series of peaks ranging up to 4,000 feet. These were dense forests of both deciduous hardwoods and coniferous evergreens, with steep, concave slopes that offered the defender superb concealment and fields of fire. The terrain was so restrictive that vehicle performance was cut to glacial speeds of only 5 to 10 miles per hour on narrow, winding roads. This made them sitting ducks for concealed anti-tank gunners. The logistical tail, stretched thin from Marseilles and Toulon, snapped under the strain. This led to critical ammunition shortages that curtailed harassing fires and halted major offensive action. More critically, the onset of the grueling green nightmare of winter conditions effectively neutralized the 2 greatest American advantages: air superiority and logistical extravagance. Daily rain, fog, sleet, and heavy snowfall from October through January choked the skies. Air operations were severely curtailed. There were only 10 flyable days in October in the 7th Army sector. A 2-week stretch in November saw virtually no sorties possible. Without the ubiquitous fighter bombers, derided by German officers as die verdammte Jabots, the fight devolved into a grinding, man-to-man contest. The American soldier, often living and attacking in the open, faced exponential increases in cold-weather injuries like immersion foot. Meanwhile, the German defenders benefited from converted houses and formidable fieldworks. This unique combination of terrain and weather created a rare combat environment. For the first time in the West since the Normandy breakout, the odds were truly even. The 7th Army, a mixed bag of veteran divisions pulled from the grueling Italian campaigns and brand new Green divisions fresh from training, was forced to test its mettle. They were fighting some of the German armies and Waffen-SS's finest combat formations, not the fuzzy-cheeked teenagers and toothless grandfathers promised in propaganda. The Vosges was a crucible, a landmark achievement in military history, where an army successfully fought its way through this historically impenetrable shield. The battle was not a technological victory, but a test of sheer training, organization, and will, culminating in that shocking, howling assault on New Year's Eve. The advance of the US 7th Army into the Vosges in October 1944 quickly transformed from a pursuit into a battle against starvation and mud. The logistical pipeline, already stretched to its breaking point from the far-off ports of Marseille and Toulon, simply could not cope with the demands of mountain warfare. Engineers struggled to maintain the unpaved secondary roads, which, already narrow and winding, turned into quagmires under the relentless autumn rain. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, and every case of K-rations had to be dragged hundreds of miles forward. Often, they were moved by hand or mule once the roads became impassable for trucks. The consequence was immediate and devastating: a critical ammunition shortage. Commanding officers received controlled supply rates for artillery. This meant only 15 to 20 rounds per gun per day, sometimes less. Harassing fires, the psychological constant of the night war, were curtailed to a maximum of 5 rounds, the offensive ground to a halt, transforming the rapid pursuit into a slow grind into the high Vosges. The men on the line, already cold and damp, realized that the massive American industrial machine had failed them here. They were fighting an infantryman's war, stripped of the overwhelming air and artillery support they had come to rely on. This grinding reality was first felt in the thickly wooded Perret forest, a preliminary major obstacle before the true mountain barrier. The 79th Infantry Division, tasked with clearing this sector, received a brutal introduction to forest combat. The woods were dense, the visibility poor, and the German defenders, a mix of remnants and hastily gathered replacements, were entrenched in prepared positions. The air in the Perret forest was thick with the perpetual smell of wet earth, pine needles, and stale smoke. The fighting was not a maneuver, but a methodical, costly clearance, often reduced to small unit actions where the enemy could be 30 yards away, unseen.
On one ridge, Lieutenant James Miller, commanding a platoon of replacements who had arrived only days before, felt the cold drizzle seep through his wool uniform, chilling him to the bone.
They were advancing through a stand of thick firs, the ground slick with mud and decaying leaves. The enemy was invisible, but their presence was announced by the distinctive high-pitched crack of the German MG-42 machine gun. That sound was one veterans knew instantly meant a 40% higher rate of fire than their own Brownings. Miller watched a new replacement, a terrified kid named Harper, freeze mid-step as a burst ripped through the branches just above his head, showering him with wood splinters. "Move," Miller hissed. "Harper, move." The German positions were expertly integrated into the terrain, featuring log crib roadblocks, extensive barbed wire, and deep minefields that swallowed up American patrols. The 79th Division suffered over 2,000 casualties in less than a month in this forest alone. This was a baptism by fire that underscored a grim reality, perfectly summed up by one anonymous American GI. He didn't care if the enemy gunner was a syphilitic prick who's 100 years old. The enemy was still sitting behind 8 feet of concrete, and he still had enough fingers to press triggers and shoot bullets. Yet the American advantage lay not in raw firepower at this moment, but in fundamental organization and training. While the Germans relied on ad hoc formations, the Volksgrenadier divisions, often lacking organic transportation and cohesion, the American divisions were standardized. Their regimental combat teams provided a flexible, cohesive, combined arms team. They had the discipline and the ingrained doctrine necessary to pivot from a brutal frontal assault to a sophisticated maneuver. This superior cohesion was about to be leveraged in a critical operation against the town of Bruyères, which controlled vital road networks deep within the Vosges Massif. To capture it, Major General Brooks, commander of the 6th Corps, needed ingenuity, not brute force. He found it in the storied 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the Go for Broke Regiment, comprised entirely of Nice soldiers. The mission was a stealthy envelopment, a surgical strike designed to bypass the strongpoint and cut its supply lines. It began on October 15, 1944. The conditions were monstrous. A grueling green nightmare of cold drizzle and ground fog. The men of the 442nd, many of them hardened veterans of the harsh Italian mountain campaigns, started their arduous uphill advance well before dawn. Their 40 pounds of gear felt like 100 as they climbed the thickly wooded ridges. They moved like ghosts. Knowing the Germans expected a frontal assault along the valley roads, the regiment chose the most difficult, unmapped and heavily forested ridgelines. Every step was a struggle against the slick mud and the dense undergrowth. The air was heavy, wet, and silent, save for the muffled thud of their boots and the ragged breathing of the men. For 3 days they pushed through the tangle of the high Vosges, their maneuver remaining completely undetected. They were fighting elements of the German Volksgrenadier divisions, units whose commander later admitted his men often cracked soon after their commitment. While the German formations were polyglot, lacking common background and exhausted from months of continuous combat, the Nice soldiers demonstrated an unbreakable unit cohesion. When the 442nd finally struck, it was from the flank and rear, completely isolating the German garrison in Bruyères. The ensuing fight was brutal. Veterans noted it was worse than Anzio. The Germans, though surprised, were determined, using every house as a pillbox. But the envelopment was decisive. Bruyères fell, and simultaneously, the 3rd Infantry Division, executing a complex deception plan, secured the town of Saint-Dié. The capture of these two critical road junctions represented more than just ground gained. It was a strategic penetration of the German Vosges defences. This landmark achievement proved that American combined arms tactics and superior training could overcome the inherent advantages of terrain and static defense. The American army had learned its lessons, adapting its maneuver warfare to the mountains, proving that Hitler's last great geographical shield was not, in fact, impenetrable. The shield had been shattered, and the door to the Alsatian plain lay open. Lieutenant General Patch, commander of the 7th Army, saw his opportunity. The strategic goal was always Strasbourg and the Rhine, and the successful penetration of the High Vosges by the 6th Corps had consumed German reserves and inflicted crippling losses. Now the advance became a frantic race, not against the enemy's speed, but against the rapidly worsening winter. The 6th Corps crossing of the Meurthe River in mid-November was the critical turning point. This positioned the American forces to attack the main Vosges defensive lines. General Oberst Balck, the veteran German panzer commander, was forced to make agonizing decisions. He pulled a panzer division out of the line to plug gaps elsewhere, thereby depriving his prepared Vosges positions of essential mobile support. The German line, held by 3 under-strength divisions, was now a brittle defense, stretched 10 kilometers between mutually supporting positions. Major General Brooks, sensing the German weakness, launched ad hoc task forces to exploit the breakthrough. The command structure, far from stifling initiative, actually encouraged it. Major General O'Daniel formed Task Force Whirlwind to race toward Sarlis. Major General Burress created Task Force Fuchs to pursue the reeling German defenders. The speed of the advance was unprecedented for a fully motorized force in midwinter mountain warfare. The German Corps commander admitted the enemy had overcome the difficulties of artillery and supply lines very quickly. The advance was a continuous, miserable struggle through the cross-compartmented Vosges terrain. Ice, snow, and relentless rain were constant adversaries. Soldiers wore field-expedient foxhole boots and endured near-freezing temperatures during all-night marches. The 103rd Infantry Division, a green unit bolstered by 6 months of supplementary training, bagged approximately 1,600 enemy prisoners in its first major push. By November 25, the pass leading to routes north and east was secured. But the real rupture came in the 15th Corps zone. The 79th Infantry Division, having learned its costly lessons in the Parot Forest, drove hard toward the Saverne Gap. The gap was a critical avenue of approach, defended by a German command structure so fractured that elements from 2 different German armies were supposed to coordinate its defense, but they couldn't even communicate effectively. Exploiting this seam, Corps Commander Hayslip ordered General Leclerc's 2nd French Armoured Division to attack through the breach. The French dash was swift and decisive. By November 21st, they reached Bouxwiller, signalling a major breakthrough onto the Alsatian plain. This threatened the wholesale envelopment of the remaining German forces still fighting in the Vosges peaks. The advance climaxed on November 23rd and 24th, with the stunning fall of Strasbourg. The French Armoured Division raced toward the Rhine, achieving the ultimate strategic objective. By November 27th, all key passes in the High Vosges were firmly in American hands. The historic medieval fortress of Haut-Königsbourg, a symbol of the Vosges' historic impregnability, was seized by the 36th Infantry Division, intact and undamaged. The geographical shield had been shattered, but the pursuit was about to run headlong into a wall of concrete and steel, the legacy of a previous war. The German retreat, having failed to hold the mountains, now aimed to use the formidable French fortifications and the forward belts of the German West Wall as their new, final defensive barrier. The American 15th Corps, grinding its way north through the low Vosges, found itself facing the complex of massive, subterranean fortresses built in the 1930s, including Schiesek, Simserhof, and Grand Hoekirkel. The fighting that erupted in December 1940 was the exact opposite of the mobile warfare the Americans preferred. It became a siege, a brutal, deliberate, and immensely costly assault on what seemed like impregnable defenses. The American infantry division's attack on Fort Freudenberg became the defining action of this new phase. The fort was a massive, multi-chambered structure specifically designed to withstand the heaviest bombardment. It was a concrete hedgehog, its firing positions protected by disappearing steel turrets and embrasures, manned now by determined German soldiers who had simply moved in and taken over the French defense. The American assault began on December 14. The artillery preparation was immense. 5 battalions of corps artillery, including 8-inch howitzers and giant 240mm howitzers, pounded the fort. The sound of the barrage was deafening, a continuous metallic roar that shook the frozen ground. But the expected effect never materialized. Shells scoring direct hits simply ricocheted harmlessly off the steel-reinforced concrete. The German strategy was simple: hold hedgehog positions in depth, making the assault so costly the attacker would give up. For the men of the infantry regiment, the attack was not a charge, but a slow, agonizing crawl through barbed wire and minefields under continuous, accurate fire. They had to get inside. The assault on Fort Schiesek, a sister fort, was a descent into subterranean hell. American engineers were tasked with the impossible, destroying a structure designed to survive a lifetime of war. Captain Thomas Rourke led a team, their faces grimed with dirt and sweat, into the fighting blocks. The air was thick with the smell of explosives and dust. They had to fight their way through concrete corridors and subterranean tunnels, waging a bizarre close-quarters war against German defenders. These Germans were protected by layers of steel and concrete, operating deep below ground in barracks and mess halls. Rourke's men carried satchel charges, their ears ringing from the concussive blasts of their own grenades. The Germans fought back with machine guns and flamethrowers, turning the tunnels into smoking, echoing death traps. It was a 3-day ordeal of crawling, blasting, and repelling counterattacks. The American engineers finally expended about 5,000 pounds of dynamite, setting off a massive charge that collapsed the fighting positions. A bulldozer was then brought up to deliver the coup de grace, sealing the defenders inside under tons of earth and rock. The cost was high: 1 officer and 15 enlisted men killed, 120 wounded, a testament to the sheer lethality of fighting static defenses. By December 20th, the guns of Schiesek were silenced. Another American division was engaged in a similar 6-day struggle for Simserhof. The Americans were winning, but at a terrible price, proving that training and cohesion could breach the line, but only through relentless attritional effort. Then, on December 16th, the entire strategic landscape shifted. Intelligence reports, initially vague, solidified into the terrifying reality of the massive German counteroffensive in the Ardennes. Operation Nordwind was coming, and the German High Command was retaining mobile reserves for it, including the armor that could have bolstered the Vosges defenses. 7th Army Field Order No. 8, issued on December 21st, reflected the new reality. Offensive operations in the Low Vosges were immediately called off. The American forces, having just fought their way through the mountains and breached the Maginot Line, now had to pivot. Units were stretched westward and northward, desperately trying to cover the exposed flanks of the Third Army. The men of the 45th Infantry Division, who had fought long and hard for the feel of German soil under their feet, were outraged to be ordered to withdraw from the West Wall. They prepared defensive positions almost sheepishly, their backs to the enemy for the first time since Anzio. The hard-won penetration of the Vosges had succeeded, but the strategic pivot, dictated by Hitler's massive gamble in the Ardennes, inadvertently created the very vulnerability the German Army Group G intended to exploit. The thin, exposed American line in the Low Vosges was now the target, setting the stage for the chaotic, howling violence of Operation Nordwind on New Year's Eve. This battle would bring them back to the frozen, blood-stained snowfields of Moraineville Farm. The timeline had circled back, bringing the narrative full force into the freezing, snow-choked passes of the Low Vosges, where the German offensive Nordwind was finally underway. It was the early hours of January 1st, 1945. The initial shock of the German New Year's assault, launched with a local numerical superiority of over 4-1 in some sectors, had been a thunderclap. The American line, stretched thin and exhausted from the brutal siege warfare against the Maginot Line defences, was reeling but not broken. The howling, disorganized charge of the German infantry, a desperate tactic meant to overwhelm the defenders through sheer volume and speed, had crashed into the well-prepared positions of the American infantry regiment, notably at the Collège de Beach and near Reyersville. The air remained bitterly cold, the kind of cold that stole the moisture from a man's lungs and turned his breath into white plumes. The moonlight, reflecting off the foot of fresh snow, provided the Germans with poor camouflage but gave the American machine gunners clear, brightly lit targets. Private Leon Outlaw's solitary defence at Schlitzen Hill, a moment of high tension and sheer tenacity, had been the immediate, visceral response to the surge. Now, as the first weak light of the new year began to grey the eastern sky, the battle shifted from a chaotic rush to a grinding, attritional struggle. The critical flaws in the German plan became brutally apparent. The German offensive had been crippled from the start by a strategic blunder rooted in arrogance and secrecy. The need for absolute surprise had superseded basic troop readiness. Units were moving into attack positions the night before without sleep, hoping Elan could compensate for their inexperience. The Volksgrenadier Division's many, composed of naval and air force personnel with only 4 weeks of infantry training, had been pushed forward with minimal reconnaissance. Oberstleutnant Linker, a German operations officer, would later observe that German troops became disorganized during their night combat due to a profound lack of knowledge of the area's terrain. This failure of preparation was severely compounded by the terrain itself. The low Vosges was a maze of dramatically compartmented, thickly wooded, snowy ravines up to 120 meters deep. The icy, winding mountain roads and limited east-west routes were a significant impediment to armoured warfare. Yet Hitler, the Bohemian corporal dictating terms to his Prussian generals, had withheld crucial armour assets, like the 21st Panzer Division, for exploitation that never materialized. By daybreak on January 1st, one Volksgrenadier division was stalled at the Blees River. Elements of other German divisions were bogged down in seesaw battles for objectives like Morainville Farm and the Bois de Bliesbrücken, places where bullets tore through the snow-covered trees. While the Germans achieved some local successes, one regiment pushing 10 kilometers toward Gotzenbruck, these initial penetrations were against weaker formations like the thin American cavalry squadron. American commanders moved immediately to plug those holes. The defense of Lemberg, a crucial strongpoint, epitomized the American ability to bend but not break. 400 hard-pressed men of one American battalion held against repeated German attacks. They were cold, surviving on sea rations that demanded as much energy to digest as they provided, but they possessed the core cohesion, the family identity, fostered during relentless training that the shattered German units completely lacked. The German command structure, hampered by internal turbulence and poor coordination, could not capitalize on even small gains. Oberst Emmerich, the First Army operations officer, later lamented that the coordination between the attacking infantry and the supporting artillery was only rarely achieved. The heavy artillery support, meant to soften the American line before the infantry advanced, proved ineffective. Instead of decisive breakthroughs, the German assaults dissipated into a pathetic assortment of poorly coordinated battalion attacks. As January 2nd dawned, the German offensive had already lost its momentum. The inadequately trained troops, overstrained by the exceedingly strenuous night marches through deep snow, were utterly worn down. Major General Hayslip, commanding the American Corps, reacted decisively. He rushed the veteran 141st Regimental Combat Team of the Texas Division forward to solidify the crumbling defenses. Because of this swift reinforcement, a disorganized German regiment that had seized Mutterhaus had to postpone its renewed attack, giving the Americans precious hours to prepare. The human cost for the Germans was immediate and unsustainable. One elite reconnaissance battalion, intended for deep penetration, lost 16 platoon leaders and company commanders in the first 10 days of 1945. These were irreplaceable losses of experienced combat leadership. By the third day of the attack, a German regimental commander reported the assault at Reipertswiller had failed. His regiment was down to only 150 men present for duty. The German War Journal, usually a repository of grim determination, began to reflect the inevitable failure. On the fifth day, it lamented that the combat power of the infantry had decreased considerably. The troops, they noted, had won ground in spite of the most difficult weather, terrain, and combat conditions, but they were simply exhausted. The American defense, characterized by depth, lethal minefields, and vigorous counterattacks, proved far too resilient. Even the replacements and reclassified specialists were effectively stonewalling the German assaults. The decisive American advantage in armor was now being felt as the battle spilled onto the Alsatian plain. The Americans fielded approximately 430 tanks, tank destroyers, and assault guns against the Germans' estimated 200. Even the deployment of self-propelled guns and Panther tanks could not break the in-depth defenses. The final desperate German thrusts toward Reipertswiller and Lichtenberg on January 7th and 8th were decisively halted and thrown back. The offensive power of the German divisions was completely exhausted. Their units, battered and weakened, were no longer capable of launching any coordinated attack. Operation Nordwind, conceived as a strategic masterstroke, had devolved into a costly tactical failure. It achieved none of its objectives, failing to cut off the Seventh Army or relieve the pressure on the Ardennes. The Vosges had again proved a crucible, but this time it was German organizational rigidity, lack of cohesion, and poor tactical planning that had been consumed by the grueling Green Nightmare. The American soldier, better trained and led, was victorious in a fight where the odds had initially been even. The Vosges was now a secondary theatre. The path to the Rhine, though bloody, was irrevocably open. The failure of Operation Nordwind in the first weeks of January 1945 sealed the fate of the German defence in the Vosges. The desperate, howling charges of the Volksgrenadiers had been repulsed by the tenacity and superior organisation of the American defence. The battle had consumed the enemy's last reserves of mobile power and morale. By mid-January, the strategic landscape shifted again, but this time the seismic movement was far to the east. 4 million Soviet troops launched devastating offensives across East Prussia, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. The Führer's attention, always fickle and focused on the immediate crisis, snapped eastward. The German High Command, now fully realizing the existential threat posed by the Red Army, began to strip nearly all its remaining quality units from the Western Front. 2 key panzer divisions, formations that could have stabilized the crumbling line in the Vosges, were gone. They were hurried off to bolster the bleeding German defences against the overwhelming Soviet tide. The German position in the west, already brittle, was left critically weakened, held by exhausted, undertrained remnants. The German withdrawal was not a rout, but a slow, agonizing process forced by strategic necessity and tactical exhaustion. The Vosges, which had historically served as an impregnable barrier, a shield that had thwarted armies for centuries, was now, for the first time, penetrated and held by an attacking force, the U.S. Seventh Army. The campaign, from the slow grind in the Paray Forest to the subterranean siege of the Maginot Line, and finally, the fierce freezing defense against Nordwind, had confirmed a core thesis about American combat prowess. This victory was not merely a function of the overwhelming material advantage often assumed in the history books. That massive advantage, air power and endless logistics, had been largely neutralized by the rugged terrain and the grueling Green Nightmare of the winter weather. Instead, the victory was fundamentally one of methodology. It was a triumph of the American mobilization training plan and its systematic, rigorous 52-week timeline. It was a victory of organizational consistency, where standardized divisions and cohesive regimental combat teams significantly reduced the friction of battle, while German units were constantly fractured, amalgamated, and reformed with ill-fitting troop types. Prussian nobles clashing with former concentration camp guards in clumsy Waffen SS headquarters. The American system fostered intense, lasting team building. The loyalty American soldiers felt for their buddies, or the strong family atmosphere, provided a powerful, enduring motivation. This contrasted sharply with the German reliance on coercion, or the fleeting Ersatzmoral of exhausted survivors. The difference lay in the doctrine of initiative. German doctrine, once known for its flexibility, had calcified under Hitler's centralized control. This denied field commanders battlefield prerogatives and led directly to the blind, costly assaults during Nordwind. American doctrine, conversely, encouraged and facilitated initiative down to the lowest levels. Commanders were given clear missions and the flexibility to execute creative deception, exploit weaknesses, and adapt, as they had in the rapid formation of ad hoc task forces like Whirlwind and Fuchs. Lieutenant General Lucian Truscott had once observed the American soldier as initially inferior in small unit tactics to the veteran German, but the GI had rapidly adapted. Oberst Hans von Luck corroborated this assessment, noting how extraordinarily flexible the Americans were, adapting immediately to changed situations and fighting with great doggedness. The campaign had been a definitive test, proving that the American GI, fighting without the primary aid of fighter bombers and massed armored formations, was more than a match for Hitler's legions, even against the finest combat formations the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS could field. The Vosges campaign finally ended, but its human cost lingered like a ghost in the frozen landscape. The legendary 442nd Go-for-Broke Regiment, having accumulated more decorations for bravery than any other American Army regiment, was immediately withdrawn to refit. Its ranks had been utterly decimated by the fighting. The weary GIs, their battered faces reflecting the squalor of the front line, traded the grim struggle for the Vosges winter line for the final desperate push toward the Rhine River. The memory of this campaign was buried deep in the historical record. It was often overlooked in favor of the spectacular tank breakthroughs in Normandy or the high drama of the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes. Yet, the sacrifice of the United States 7th Army serves as a permanent marker of courage. This history is dedicated to the soldiers who never returned home. They rest now in rank upon rank of white marble markers at Epinal, Saint-Avold, and other forgotten places across France. Their sacrifice proved that the caution sometimes displayed by American commanders was not timidity. It was a deliberate, necessary strategy to preserve the unit cohesion and high morale required for sustained victory. In the Vosges, the brutal terrain and the relentless winter weather had stripped away the technological advantages of the American forces. But the American soldier fought and won anyway. This victory confirmed that deep training, solid organization, and the raw will to adapt were the true determinants of combat prowess, even when the odds were suddenly even. The rusted relics, the scars left on the village houses, and the white snow that briefly turned red remain the mute, enduring testament to the brutal, hard-won triumph of the United States 7th Army. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these critical stories for future generations. And please, share your own memories or thoughts on this campaign in the comments below.